Welcome Internet, the psychoanalytic talk, and today we're going to be talking about the distinction between the Jungian persona and the false self of Donald Winnicott. So before we start this discussion proper, you should know that normally both of those concepts don't go together, they don't mix. For historical reasons, as Jung was pushed out of psychoanalysis mainstream, his ideas were not really reintegrated, or very sporadically. That doesn't mean people were not aware of. For example, Karen Horney does talk about the persona in her book, The Neurotics of Our Time. And a great deal of authors also do talk about the persona to an extent or another. But, and this is a big but, it stays very relative, right? It's like it's picked on, but it's really just like touched from the tip of the fingers, right? So there's no great development of the persona within psychoanalysis. But before we really delve into the difference between the false self and the persona, I need to explain the two concepts. So let's start with the persona, as I am on a way to developing that idea first and foremost. So the persona, very succinctly, is a normal interface between the ego and the world, as we don't experience the world just as ourselves, but we also put on a mask that's symbolic, that allows us to reach out to others, to present something to others, which is both coherent for ourselves and for our egos and for the person talking to us, meaning that it's a certain frame that allows us to interact with people in a broader sense. That persona can be constituted by myriad of elements. It can be a job, like for example, being a doctor, being a teacher, being a psychologist, being a nurse, being a policeman, being a firefighter, and so on and so forth. Or it can be an attribute, like being a mother, being a brother, being a neighbor, and so on and so forth. But in that presentation of the world that we give to the world, and in which normally we recognize ourselves, maybe not always, but most of the time we do. There's a point in which we can relate to others, and others can relate to our persona. So it's a very fundamental core element of our psyche that allows us for interpersonal relationships with others. And it is very important. For Jung, it is shared by everyone, and those that don't have a persona are for Jung considered dreamers, quote unquote, with that word, that are not able to integrate fully into society, or to the point where they can really start growing themselves because they're too lost into themselves to be able to connect with others. So the persona is there in order for everyone to be able to constitute a coherentness and cohesiveness within society. Of course, that doesn't mean to say that there is no problems with the persona, because there might be. And for Jung, there are problems when the person merges with the persona, with the identity of the ego becomes that of the persona. In those cases, the people might overly invest their functions. For example, if they feel that they have this job or this attribute, they might over invest in those things and then start only seeing themselves as those attributes or those professions. This implies a real true danger, as the ego starts to crumble by the weight of the persona. But for Jung, those are not necessarily common problems, and here we're starting also to overlap with Winnicott's concept of false self. So it's a nice point. I'm going to transition to the false self. So the false self for Winnicott is a part of the personality which is not genuine. The genuine self and the true self in his theory was not able to come forward in an authentic way and in a way in which it could be accepted. Therefore, the individual creates, here again, a mask, but this mask is much more rigid, and it has developed in order to be able to engage with the outside world without being destroyed internally. This dichotomy is quite different, as Winnicott puts the false self not as something that's necessarily just social, but he puts it and its etiology at the relationship between the mother and the child in early infancy. For him, the mother is not able to see the child for who the child really is, and the child has to very, very soon in his development, very, very early on, have to adapt to the mother, has to send out a positive mirror to the mother, and cannot express who he truly is or who she truly is without fear of what they are being non-integrated by the mother, or worse, even attacked by the mother figure. So here the false self is going to give something in which the individual, and there's many degrees of the false self for Winnicott, in which the individual is going to live a life that's not really his, and the ego and the false self and the true self are not really they're not connected, meaning the false self takes all the picture, which gives this impression that in a way that there is only the mask, and if you start scratching, there might not be something under the surface, at least in the more extreme situations of the false self, not necessarily in the more benign false self, which is also very interesting because for Winnicott there is a myriad of degrees, but there is a normal one in which the false self is just a part of you which is adapted, and you don't say to people what you think out loud because it might put you in trouble. So that degree, as we can see, is quite close to the persona. And that's why I wanted to make this video, because I do feel that there is an innate problem, because for me, and this is my point of view, and I don't want you to think it's shared across the board. For me, the persona is the non-pathological and completely normal and welcoming and welcomed part of the individual that's going to adapt to society. And that adaptation is a net positive, as the individual can navigate through a system with the rules, with the knowledge, with how to do it, and even with the rituals of society. And when I mean the rituals of society, I don't mean like that in a grandiose way. I mean, like, for example, when you go, for example, at your job or your work, and you have to say hello to everyone, or you have to shake hands, or do what the French call la bise. All of these elements are ritualistic because we're all supposed to do it. But it's our persona that allows us to interact with other people, even if we don't really want to or don't feel the need to. We still abide by all those rules because we understand that we have to in order to fit in, at least to a degree. That doesn't mean that you always have to fit in, and it doesn't mean that it's always a good idea to fit in, but that fitting inness is possible thanks to the persona and to the role that you attribute to yourself and that others attribute to you by extension. And therefore it is, in Jung's vocabulary, something that's non-pathological. Whereas for Winnicott, the false self, even though he has a side of it that's non-pathological, it seems very clear that for him the false self is much deeper, much, much more severe and rigid, that it's not merely about navigating social relationships or knowing the rituals. It's about an over adherence to the phenomena, to others, to society on the whole, which prevents the individual from being genuine. That preventiveness from being genuine isn't something that is in the persona, not fundamentally, because the persona doesn't prevent genuineness. It, on the contrary, can bring genuineness, and genuineness can come out when the person is in a situation where that genuineness is going to be accepted. Whereas the false self, even if the person who has a false self is in a place in which people are willing to accept who they are, their true selves, and be in a real relationship with them, they're still not going to show it, because those are unconscious defense mechanisms against that, because there is a fundamental idea in the false self that the true self cannot re-emerge. If not, that would be destroyed. And the fragility of the true self is so extreme that it cannot even take the risk of it manifesting itself, which is very, very different from the persona, as the persona is in of itself something that can allow the ego or the true self to emerge, whereas the false self is there as a defense mechanism and a defense system that's very, very operative and doesn't allow for that type of connection because it's too risky. As such, the false self is still very adapted. Most patients that have a false self are very good, have good careers, are incredibly polite. The false self is, in a lot of ways, socially a success. It's only subjectively that it's a failure in the fact that the person is not living their lives, their true lives. They're just pretending to the others and to themselves. And that's the whole work with the false self, is to try and get the true self or part of the true self to re-emerge. As my supervisor once told me, she feels that the true self, it comes also in layers. Therefore, and I found that idea very interesting, so I wanted to share it with you today. So you might not be emerged the whole true self of the person and they can completely become genuine, but you can let part of the true self emerge, come forward and grow. But that is only possible with a lot of psychotherapy, as it's the relationship of the psychotherapy which is going to allow the false self to diminish, to break down enough, not totally, but enough for the true self to be able to seep in, drop by drop or element by element. And it's only through the restorative process which is in psychotherapy, the fact of having an individual that listens, that seeks that true self, that is helping you develop that true self, that you can really start to have it emerge. But because even if for example, your environment is really good, it's not going to fundamentally allow your true self to shine, as people don't necessarily know that you're in a false self, whereas even though people don't necessarily think about it, they kind of know that there is a persona-ish knowledge or interaction with you, whereas the false self doesn't seem like a persona. It's something much deeper, much more embedded. And in the same way, a persona can be easily lifted in the right conditions, or even at certain moments. Namely, for example, when you make a joke, or when you do something that's not really in your function, or how other people see you, or even how you see yourself. But you can still do it, because that's the whole aspect of the persona, is that it can break character from time to time. False self is much more difficult and needs a real lot of work in order for it to really be able to come forward in a genuine and positive and non-threatening way, meaning the true self doesn't feel threatened. There's another thing, is that the people might not even know at the beginning of therapy that they have a false self. And the therapist might not even know it as well. It's only through a lot of work and a lot of respect for both parties that one can start to see the false self really as an entity of its own. And Winnicott insists a lot to the fact that those people need very special treatment, meaning that you can't really... They're going to be in panic once the false self starts to decrease, because that's how they live their lives. That's how they feel that their lives was given to them. And that decrease puts them in a position of fragility that the therapist needs to know about and needs to be preoccupied by. And what Winnicott insists is that you need to really, when you're working with people with false selves and you're deconstructing the false self, to be there. Like, for example, if they ask for extra sessions, if, for example, instead of one session, you do 1 or 2 or 3 sessions a week, and you have to also be there. He was there, Winnicott, to the extent that he even used to take physically care of his patients by cooking for them, by seeing them at their homes. I mean, that's a point of debate and contention, because is it really what the patient needs? I mean, I'm saying that because those are often questions that are brought up when we study the false self. Has it gone too far? And that's a really good question. But nevertheless, you can see that the implication of the therapist is immense in that phenomena of the false self. Whereas within the persona, quickly it can just give way to something more genuine, something more real. And I also wanted you to know that because of the non-merging of those two concepts, persona and false self, it is quite rare to see someone use both of them. But here I'm doing it because I think both of them should be considered quite differently. And I think that the last degree, the normal degree of false self of Winnicott, and that's my opinion, is a bad idea, because that genuinely, I feel, hurts his whole theory that it's something of an pathological adaptation. Because if everyone is pathologically adapted, well, then there is no true and false selves. It's just like ego and persona. So if we are willing to just cut off that part of the false self as a theoretical aspect rather than the clinical aspect, the whole point of view of Winnicott works really, really, really well, and is completely complementary with the Jungian vision of sins. And that's how I personally see it. The more superficial elements of personality that are shown to the world is constitutive of the persona, and the deeper, more inaccessible traits, but are still fake, are the false self. And of course, at the bottom of everything is the true self that can't fully emerge, as that's not always possible in every circumstance. And even if it were, it might not be a good idea to let it come forward fully. So it's always transactional. There's always a point where the true self might emerge and then it might go back. So, I mean, there's a lot of variety and richness about all these concepts, but I just wanted to underline what I felt about the difference between the persona and the false self. So that pretty much sums up what I had to say about the topic. If you have any questions or anything you would like to ask, please feel free to do so in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.